I woke up before dawn, the kitchen window still dark except for the weak blue of morning. I could hear the coffee maker clicking, like a small steady metronome calling me into the day. The smell of cinnamon and warm oats filled the house, my Sunday ritual for 43 years. I spooned the apple into my bowl and watched the steam rise. It steadied me. For a while. Harold used to sit across from me, one knee knocking the table, telling me something silly before church. He's been gone 7 years now. The radio on the counter was quiet. I watered my African violets on the sill. Their damp soil smelled faintly of earth and old sun. I said the same prayer I always say, a whisper into my palms, and then I tucked a thin folder into my bag. Copies of bank statements. Transfer records that didn't make sense. 12 years as volunteer treasurer taught me how numbers tell the truth even when people do not. Driving to First Baptist of Oak Ridge, the town still asleep, I felt the folder's weight like a secret against my hip. The church steeple caught the first light, a pale spear of gold against the sky. I replayed the week in my head. The transfers with no memo, the checks made out to names I'd never seen, the late-night calls I'd asked for explanations about and received closed mouths and practiced smiles. Faith had always been the place I could lay burdens down. This time faith felt fragile like glass. I took my usual seat, third pew on the right, slid into the familiar groove of the wood. The varnish had the smell of old prayer books and lemon polish. My hands rested on my lap. I touched the strand of small pearls at my throat without thinking. The pearls Harold gave me for our 20th. They had become part of me, a little bell against my collarbone when I breathed. I felt the fabric of my navy dress, smooth and cool, and the sweat prickling at the base of my neck even though the room was supposed to be cooled. Pastor Franklin's voice rose and fell from the chancel. He always filled the room, precise and practiced. Today his sermon was about loyalty and trust. There are wolves among us, he said, and the phrase slotted into the rows of people like a pebble dropped into still water. Heads tilted. Eyes shifted. Diane sat behind the pulpit, her posture a portrait of control, a crease of tension at the corner of her mouth. She watched me with that gaze that's only for someone who's under a microscope. Behind me, Marlene's floral perfume puffed the air into sweetness, making my stomach turn a little. The AC hummed at the back, but it felt too warm, breathy. I noticed too many small things at once. A phone blinking on the pew in front of me, Jason Franklin's hand hovering near his belt, the hum of the organ under the words. My breath got shallow. My fingers tightened around the folder hidden in my lap. The pearls bit into my skin. The pastor spoke of Judas and betrayal. The words landed like pebbles. I kept my palms folded, knuckles white. That's when I saw Walter moving down the aisle. He was older than most of us, thin, his white hair combed back the way always. He wore the faded black suit he liked, the one with the threadbare elbow. He stopped beside me and touched my shoulder, a light touch that felt like an anchor and a warning all at once. Eleanor, he said, almost inaudible, so close I felt his breath on my ear. Leave the sanctuary now. His hand was steady. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. There was a tremor in his voice that made the words take on two meanings. I didn't ask why. My legs were jelly and I rose as if someone had pulled a string. People's heads turned. I could feel dozens of stares pressing through the air like heat. Walter's palm was cool and firm at the small of my back as he guided me to the center aisle. The pew under my fingers was polished and hard, the varnish slick against the pads of my fingertips. Outside, the foyer smelled of coffee and the church's lemon-scented cleaner. My granddaughter Rachel waited near the glass doors, her eyes rimmed red. She wore the floral dress I'd bought her for graduation. When I saw her, the knot in my chest loosened a little, and then tightened again. She slipped her hand into mine. "They're saying things, Grandma," she whispered. Her voice shook. She had that tiny tattoo of a cross on her wrist, where I could see it even now. "Jason's showing something on your laptop. People are whispering." Before I could answer, a sound tore through the building. A sudden terrifying crack like thunder split in half. It was immediate and raw. The floor seemed to shiver beneath my shoes. Then came the screams. Something heavy and glassy, a sound like breaking ice, hammered the air. Rachel and I ran to the doors without thinking. The sanctuary doors burst open under our hands. There, where I had been sitting a heartbeat before, lay glass and crystal in a jagged, unnatural silence. The chandelier that had hung above the center aisle was smashed across the pews. Shards littered the hymnals. People were scrambling, some coughing, some covered in splinters. Blood trickled on a woman's sleeve. The smell of dust and fear and hot metal filled my mouth. I looked for Pastor Franklin. He stood frozen mid-aisle. His face a movie of practiced composure ripped away. For a moment his eyes met mine and something like surprise flickered there. Then Walter was at my side again, his face wet with tears, his voice breaking. "I didn't know," he said, the words tumbling out. "They told me to get you out. They said that you were the problem." He couldn't finish. He wiped his hands on his trousers as if to rid himself of some invisible dirt. The choir box radio kept playing the hymn from earlier, the notes wandering over the chaos like gulls over storm water. I stood in the middle of it all, my pearls cold under my palm, the folder still in my bag. The world narrowed to the thunder of my own heart and a single, absurdly bright shard of crystal catching the sunlight and throwing it back into my eyes. The pastor's words, the touch of Walter's hand, Rachel's little cross under my thumb, they all arranged themselves into a thin, hard line that ran straight into what came next. Leave the sanctuary now. Deacon Walter's words were so low I almost thought I imagined them. I looked at him confused. His eyes didn't meet mine, but his hand landed on my shoulder with a gentle firmness that made me stand without question. "My loves, thank you for being here with me. I know your time is precious. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber is like a breath of hope. If this story moves you, please click subscribe. We're trying to reach our first 1,000, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. It makes this feel less like speaking into the void and more like coming home." I woke up before dawn as I always do. The kitchen was a soft blue silence. The coffee maker clicked its steady rhythm. I made my oatmeal, cinnamon, chopped apple, the same bowl Harold used to tease me about. He's been gone 7 years, but Sunday rituals keep him close. I watered my African violets on the sill. The potting soil smelled like old summers and sun-baked hands. I folded a thin folder into my bag. Bank statements, transfer records, things that don't lie even when people do. 12 years as volunteer treasurer taught me how to read a story in numbers. There were transfers with no memo, checks to names I didn't recognize, deposits that showed up and then vanished. I had asked questions quietly earlier in the week, and been met with practiced smiles and tangled explanations. The fundraiser for the new community center, $2.8 million, should have been transparent. It wasn't. Driving into town, the steeple of First Baptist of Oak Ridge cut a pale line against the sky. I felt the folder like a second heartbeat at my hip. I sat in my usual pew, third on the right, where the wood has molded to my shape over decades. The varnish smelled faintly of lemon polish and old hymnals. I touched my pearl necklace without thinking. Harold had given them to me long ago. They settled warm against my throat. Pastor Franklin filled the sanctuary with his voice, smooth and measured. Today his sermon was on loyalty and trust. "There are wolves among us," he said, and the phrase landed like a ripple across the congregation. Diane sat behind the pulpit, perfect as always, eyes hawkish. I felt watched. Marlene's floral perfume rose behind me, sweet and cloying. The air conditioning hummed, but my skin prickled. I noticed small things that morning. Jason Franklin's phone glowing in his lap, his jaw tight. The church laptop, normally locked in the office, absent from its place. My hands tightened around the folder in my bag until the paper whispered. Then Walter came down the aisle. He was older, stooped. Before I could answer, the building shuddered. A sound like thunder split in half tore through the sanctuary. Wood creaked. A glass scream followed. Rachel grabbed my hand and we ran back to the doors. The doors burst open onto a scene I will never forget. The great crystal chandelier that had hung above the center aisle lay shattered across the pews, the exact spot I had been sitting. Glass sparkled against hymnals like broken light. People were coughing, scrambling, some with cuts, some stunned. Dust hung in the air, biting the back of my throat. I tasted metal and fear. I found Pastor Franklin standing frozen, his practiced composure stripped away. For a second his eyes met mine and something like genuine surprise passed over his face. Walter reached me again, this time with tears tracking down his cheeks. He looked like a man pulled in two directions. "I didn't know," he said, voice breaking. "Jason told me they needed you out. Said you were the problem. They wanted me to move you before anything happened." He stopped, hands trembling. He pressed them into his coat as if to hide the shame. "When I saw where that chandelier fell, I thought I'd killed you." In the days that followed, the FBI walked through our church like strangers in an old photograph. Evidence, subpoenas, interviews. They found a scheme that had been hidden for years. Pastor Franklin, his son Jason, and 2 deacons were charged. Documents had been planted on my computer. Checks had been doctored. They had planned to pin it all on me and wipe the trail with a staged accident. They underestimated Walter's conscience and the way fate wedges itself into the smallest choices. The congregation fractured. Some people begged forgiveness with hollow eyes. Others turned away, embarrassed by what they defended. I held both reactions without bitterness. It's a strange mercy to be hurt by people you trusted and to survive it. Walter stopped by my kitchen once, hands shaking, and left me the worn Bible he'd carried since his youth. "For the nights," he said, and I understood. 6 months later, the church is changing. The sanctuary has a new chandelier. Tasteful, less ostentatious, and a new pastor who listens more than he speaks. Members who left have trickled back. People hang their heads in apology, some avoid my gaze, some find my hand and hold it like a lifeline. I accept both the avoidance and the embraces with a quiet that surprised me. I still sit in the 3rd pew on the right sometimes, fingers tracing the varnish. My pearl necklace rests against my collarbone like a tiny bell. The folder is tucked in a drawer at home now, not because I stopped being cautious, but because I learned to choose the battles I carry into public. Faith for me is a brittle and beautiful thing. Can be tested in the pew beside you. And it can also be kept alive by the small messy acts of people who finally tell the truth. I wake before the sun most Sundays. It's a habit stitched into me like the hem of an old dress. The kitchen is a soft blue until the light changes. The coffee machine clicks and sighs, a small metronome that says the day is beginning. I measure my oats the same way I always have. A cup, a pinch of cinnamon, 1 apple chopped into little moons. The steam lifts and carries cinnamon into the morning. It steadies me. Harold used to hum as he buttered his toast. He's been gone 7 years, but the house keeps his rhythms. I water the African violets on the windowsill and smell damp earth and old sun. Their leaves are velvety under my fingers, a little like the church hymnals, soft from being opened and loved. I glance at the thin folder on the counter. Bank statements. Transfer records. Numbers that don't lie. I fold it into my bag like a talisman and kiss the pearls at my throat. Harold gave me those pearls on our 20th anniversary. They've become part of my Sunday skin. I am 68. I have been the volunteer treasurer at First Baptist of Oak Ridge for 12 years. People know me by my voice at the bake sale table, by my casserole dish at potluck, by the way I straighten hymnals in the pews. I keep the books because I trust accounts to speak the truth, and because stewardship feels like worship. The church is where Harold and I built a life, where we voted on roof repairs and welcomed babies and sat with grieving families. This place taught me how to pray aloud and how to fold a casserole into a paper plate without making a mess. On Friday, I spotted a cluster of transfers with no memo. On Tuesday, a deposit appeared then vanished. I'm old enough to remember when money moved slow and clear. These entries were like smoke on a still morning, easy to miss until someone coughs. The fundraiser for the new community center, $2.8 million, ought to be on the ledger in broad, honest strokes. Instead, the numbers had hairpins and secret knots. Driving to church that Sunday, the town still smelled like damp pavement and diesel. The steeple caught the first wash of light, a pale spear above Main Street. Church bells were already ringing, slow and round, the kind of bell that seems to pull prayers up and put them on the roof. I felt the folder press against my hip like a small secret weight. I sit in the third pew on the right. It has a groove worn into the wood by a dozen Sundays' worth of me. The varnish smells faintly of lemon cleaner and old pages. There is an empty seat beside me where Harold used to sit. Every time I place my hand on that space, I feel the memory of his elbow, the tiny scuffs where his coat brushed the pew. That empty place is a kind of bell, ringing in its absence. At the front of the sanctuary, the altar is simple. A brass cross, a small Bible, a chipped offering plate that has collected decades of coins. The curtain behind the pulpit is a deep burgundy, heavy as a curtain in an old theater. Sometimes, in a certain light, it looks almost black. The color comforts me. It makes everything else warm. It hides the scaffolding, the seams. I notice small things now in ways I didn't used to. The chandelier over the central aisle, ornate, crystal, tilts a fraction to the left. A bulb near the center flickers once when someone passes beneath. The custodian swears he'll fix it next week. These are the kinds of details most people don't see until they become trouble. A loose screw, a forgotten repair, a ledger entry that doesn't make sense until it maddeningly does. People move in and out of the rows like tide. Marlene's perfume blooms behind me, too sweet, the smell of her casseroles. Diane sits in her place behind the pulpit, immaculate as a postcard. Her posture a practice in control. Pastor Franklin's voice fills the room, polished, exact. His hand gestures are always careful. He gives the kind of smiles that have been rehearsed in mirrors. I have found comfort in his sermons before. He has married couples, baptized babies, pronounced benedictions over us all. Faith for me has been an anchor and a question both. I believe in the God who shows up in hospital waiting rooms and at kitchen tables and in the way neighbors shovel snow for each other. But faith is not blind. It is a muscle that needs work. Being treasurer taught me to pray with numbers. A ledger doesn't forgive mistakes. It simply records them. When something feels wrong, you follow the line until it tells its story. I had thought about asking someone quietly, privately. I thought about Walter, who has carried his Bible and his small suit like armor for longer than I can remember. He's always been careful with his words. But there is a certain courage that comes with being older, and having nothing left to lose by asking the hard question. I practiced the phrase in my head as I buttoned my coat. Can we look at the transfers? It felt like stepping onto a high place. The bells chimed again, calling us to our places. Sunlight pooled on the hymnals. A hymn book lying open showed a notation in Harold's handwriting under hymn 248. A small familiar scrawl that steadied me. I tucked my folder under my arm, fingers whitening around the paper. The sanctuary filled with voices rising in the first verse. I felt the press of community, comforting and complicated all at once. There was an empty pew near the back that morning too. The seat someone had left when they were called away, or when they chose to step out, sat there like a question mark. When I looked at it, I felt a cold ribbon of premonition. I told myself not to read signs into empty chairs. Still, the air seemed a little different. The curtain behind the pulpit caught the light and threw it back like a warning, and I kept my hand on the pearls at my throat, thinking of Harold's laugh, and of the ledger quietly whispering truths I could no longer ignore. I woke up before dawn like I always have. The house was a soft blue. The coffee maker clicked its steady little rhythm. I made my own. The pews smelled of lemon polish and old hymnals. I slid into my usual seat, third on the right, where the wood has worn to the shape of my hips over decades. There is a comfort in routine that is almost physical. My hand brushed the little groove in the varnish and I felt steadied by habit for a breath. But the folder under my arm was heavier than habit. Pastor Franklin's voice filled the room. Smooth. Precisely modulated. He spoke about loyalty and trust today. There are wolves among us, he said, and the sentence landed like something sharp on the back of my neck. Diane sat behind him, immaculate as ever, eyes like two small gates. She watched me. I felt the gaze like a counting hand. My heart started to quicken. The air seemed too warm. Marlene's perfume bloomed behind me, a cloying sweetness that made my stomach roll. Jason Franklin was in the front row, jaw set, phone glowing in his palm, his posture all careful angles. The church laptop was missing from the office where I locked it, where I keep digital copies of the ledgers. A small cold current of unease ran down my spine. When he began to speak of betrayal, Judas named in the same breath as servitude, I felt my palms go slick. The pearls at my throat suddenly felt like an accusation. I told myself to breathe. I counted the measures of the hymn under my breath. Breath in, breath out. But my lungs felt small, as if someone had tucked them down into my belly. Then Walter came down the aisle. He moves slowly now. The years have bent him a little and his hands tremble at the edges. He wore the same faded black suit he's had for as long as I can remember. He stopped beside me and laid a cool hand on my shoulder. His touch steadied me and unraveled me at the same time. Eleanor, he said, so quietly that at first I thought I hadn't heard. He didn't meet my eyes. His voice had the sound of someone delivering something they didn't want to carry. Leave the sanctuary now. Time did a strange thing. For a beat nothing moved. The organ hummed underneath the sermon like a held breath. People glanced up, but no one stood. My knees felt like loose wood. A cold band wrapped around my throat. The folder in my bag seemed suddenly ferocious with its own weight. Every instinct told me to ask why. I had rehearsed the conversation to myself all week. May I see the accounts? I had practiced saying. I pictured Walter as an ally, a man of prayer who would help us fix whatever needed fixing. But his hand at my back was gentle and firm. His eyes were not on me. They were on the pulpit. There was an urgency there that pressed against my ribs. My fingers closed around the pearls. They cut little crescents into my skin. My breath came short and sharp. A small hot taste of fear rose at the back of my tongue. I could feel the church around me like a skin, warm with devotion, thin with rumor, trembling with the possibility of rupture. I rose. My knees made a noise that sounded too loud in my own ears. People turned. Faces shifted. The usual softness of churchgoers' expressions had changed into something harder. Curiosity, suspicion. Something I'd never expected to find there. My heart pounded under my ribs like a small drum. My breathing felt shallow like a window cracked open a hair. I walked down the center aisle with Walter guiding me in that way. A man helps the afflicted. His palm rested at the small of my back, and he kept me moving without answering. I wanted to ask. I wanted to say, what did I do? I wanted to lay the folder on the pulpit and let the truth stand naked between us. But my voice would not come. The words sat in my throat like stones. Outside, the foyer smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner. Light came in through the glass doors like a promise that the world had not yet decided how it would treat me. Rachel stood near the door, my granddaughter, her eyes red at the rims. She reached for my hand. Her small cross tattoo flashed as she tucked a curl behind her ear. "They're saying things, Grandma," she whispered. Her voice quivered. "Jason's showing something on your laptop." I didn't answer. For a second I thought I might turn back. But Walter's hand, steady, insistent, kept me moving. I stepped through the doorway and the heavy church door closed behind me with a soft final sound. The congregation's hum turned into a single distant note. My chest felt raw. My hands were cold, the skin pale where the folder had rubbed. I had come ready to ask, ready to expose the numbers and demand truth. Instead, I had left without asking why. And in that unspeaking choice, something irrevocable shifted. My heart hammered. My breath came ragged. The folder was a weight at my hip, a secret against my side. I stood in the foyer and felt the whole world hold its breath with me. The foyer still smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner when Walter reached into his coat pocket and set a small, worn Bible on my kitchen table. His hands trembled as he did it, a movement I had watched for years, always gentle, now almost apologetic. He avoided my eyes. He kept rubbing the corner of the book with his thumb, as if he could buff away what had happened. "I brought this for you," he said, voice thin. "For the nights." I looked at the Bible, at the creased spine, then at him. The light from the window cut across his face, showing the white hair at his temples like a halo that had been dimmed. His mouth opened and closed. He swallowed. "You shouldn't have touched me that Sunday," I said. My words felt small in the kitchen, but they landed between us like a plate on a table. I watched his shoulders hitch. "I know," he whispered. "I know. They told me things about transfers, about you. They said you were a threat. Jason. He said they needed you gone." He stopped. His eyes filled, but he didn't let them spill. He folded his hands around the Bible until the knuckles blanched. Rachel stood behind him, fingers fretting at the strap of her purse. Her tattoo showed when she brushed a curl behind her ear. The tiny cross I watched her get 2 summers ago. She didn't speak. She held my gaze the way a child steadies a parent, as if by holding me steady she could keep me from falling apart. Later, during the town meeting, Diane sat in the second row like she'd been placed there by someone arranging a stage. Her hands were immaculate, nails polished to a soft pink. She kept tapping the edge of her purse with the same rhythm she tapped the lectern when Pastor Franklin spoke. When she looked at me, her smile was filed down to a neat, professional angle. "We all want what's best for the church," she said, voice smooth as a polished floor. "We wanted to protect the congregation. You understand that, don't you, Eleanor?" Her words wore the weight of rehearsed absolution. The subtext was a clipboard of excuses. Loyalty, duty, keeping the image intact. I felt the old familiar sting, being measured and found wanting by people who had never had to answer for their own choices. "I understand protecting people," I said. "I also understand hiding things. They're different." My hands were folded in my lap. The pearls at my throat rested like a small, accusing clock. After the meeting, Mr. Carter from the Wednesday sewing circle came up and pressed his palms to mine. His breath smelled of tobacco and choir practice. "Forgive me, Mrs. Davis," he said. His eyes were round and wet. We followed the leadership. We were wrong. Forgiveness can be an awkward thing, I've learned. Some people meant it. Some said it to smooth the tremor in their own conscience. I accepted Mr. Carter's apology like I accepted a casserole, with grace and a small reserved thank you. But not everyone could meet my eyes. Old friends glanced away, mouths tightening into polite lines. There were children I'd watched grow who now sat with their mothers and leaned in, whispers muffled by hymnals. Suspicion leaves a residue that doesn't wash off with Sunday coffee. Walter came by that week more than once. Each time he arrived, he sat in my kitchen chair and folded and unfolded his hands. He'd tell a small, halting story about the garden or the church roof. He never said directly what he had done. He didn't have to. The silence between us carried its own truth. "You could have stayed," I told him once, watching steam curl up from his mug. "You could have stood with me in the pew." He looked at me then, finally, not at the pearls, not at the folder on my counter, but at me. For a second his eyes were young and raw. "I thought I was helping," he said. and the words were honest in a way the rest had not been. I was afraid. When Jason told me, I thought I'd be doing the... Diane came to my house once late, with the evening pressing the windows dark. She stood on my porch like a statue living a private hesitation. She didn't come in. She lowered her head and said, "We thought we were protecting something sacred." Her voice cracked on the last word. The perfume she wore, the same I'd noticed behind me that Sunday, was softer now, laced with regret. She reached up and smoothed a stray hair back into her bun with the tremor of someone who is trying to iron out a crease you can't see. "Is it reconciliation you want?" I asked her, though I didn't know the answer for myself. "No," she said, and the one syllable hit with a clean honesty that surprised me. "I want forgiveness." It's easier, I think, to ask for forgiveness than to do the hard work that earns it. Diane's eyes betrayed a pleading I could not refuse. She had helped build a life with Pastor Franklin. She had classed him in the hospital when his father died. She had synced her life to his sermons. To lose that is to find an echo where once there was music. I found myself forgiving them in small increments, a word here, a held silence there, because holding on to bitterness takes more energy than I have. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It does not mean I will not carry the ledger in my mind like a small, careful flame. I will watch the books. I will ask questions. I will not let the sanctuary be a place where fear is used to hide wrongs again. Sometimes at night, I take Walter's Bible from the drawer and run my thumb over its cover. The leather is warm from his hands. The pages smell of dust and prayer and the faint citrus of someone else's cologne. I open it to a page he dog-eared, and there is a margin note in his handwriting. "Keep watch. Keep faithful." The chandelier falls in my mind sometimes. A sudden bright fracture across an otherwise ordinary day. The glass catches sunlight and throws it back in splinters. But the light is still light. It finds ways out of broken things. Rachel squeezes my hand when we pass the sanctuary now. She doesn't flinch when people look. She wears her little cross-like armor and like an invitation. Sometimes she leans close and whispers, "You were brave, Grandma." I press my fingers into hers and feel the steady thrum of a life that keeps on. I tell her, "So were you." We stand together and let the church be a place of hard reckonings and slow healings. The ledger is different now. So am I. The work of rebuilding is small, a conversation, a meeting, a return chair, and it is, at the same time, everything. After the arrest, the town folded around me like a door closing, soft at first, then with that final thunk that means you are on the outside. It started in the smallest ways. Mrs. Green from the church pantry would pass me on Main Street and nod without stopping, her grocery bag swinging like a metronome of distance. Where once she would have paused to ask about my granddaughter, she now kept her eyes on the cracked sidewalk as if the sunlight might spill gossip like water. Sundays changed in ways that felt brutal and deliberate. The foyer no longer hummed with the same easy chatter. People circled around one another the way ducks avoid a puddle. Hands that used to reach for mine during the passing of the peace fumbled for hymnals or cough drops instead. Children I'd sung with in choir rehearsals ducked behind parents and clutched their hymnals so tightly the corners creased. One little boy, who used to press his face against the pew where Harold and I sat, asked his mother in a very loud whisper if I was going to be mean now. She tightened her jaw and moved him along. The sewing circle, once a place of laughter and the soft snip of scissors, thinned. The folding table still smelled of starch and tea, but there were empty chairs with name cards folded down like little tombstones. Mrs. Carter, who used to bring me the Tuesday bulletin and a wink, now avoided my porch in the mornings and left church notices folded at my gate. The casserole rhoda had a hole where my name used to be. Someone whispered liability in the kitchen and the word landed on a glass dish like a lid. Doors shut in my face the way seasons change. Not physically, mostly. A woman I'd babysat for years called to cancel a lunch, until things settle. Diane Matthews Franklin's assistant avoided my eyes in the supermarket, pretending to check the price of oranges. Diane herself stood at the far end of a church meeting once, immaculate as ever, and when our gazes brushed she gave me the precise, professional half-smile that made my skin prickle. It was a performance I once would have helped smooth, and now it felt like the closing scene on a stage where I'd been written out. At the post office, the clerk's forked stare made me hand over my change like I was passing a small, dangerous thing. The woman at the bank smiled at my withdrawals but didn't ask about the ledger as she once had. Even the kids at the preschool, who used to wave with sticky fingers when I came to teach how to fold a donation envelope, looked away as if I carried a contagious hush. Gossip turned into a fabric you could cut through with a knife. It wrapped the town in a pleasant, murderously tidy cloak of certainty. They always did say the treasurer loved being in charge, someone said in the pew behind me one Sunday, loud enough for me to hear. You can't blame them for wanting answers. It was the sort of sentence that pretends to be fair and is not. Another whispered. She always did have an opinion. Opinions used to be part of who I was. Now they folded me into a story I hadn't written. The hardest moments were the small, ordinary betrayals. Invitations stopped coming. The phone that used to ring with offers of help or a plea for a casserole stayed quiet. Volunteer lists for Sunday school and the food pantry were shuffled so my name slid off like a coin falling through a slot. A teenager I'd taught to play the piano avoided me in church, fingers twitching as if embarrassed by a memory. And yet there were fissures of something else, awkward, human, sometimes shame-laced. Mr. Carter from the sewing circle looked at me with wet eyes and said, "Forgive me, Eleanor." He couldn't meet my face. His apology was a small, honest thing, and it landed in me like a pebble in a quiet pond. It rippled outwards in ways that surprised me. A note left under my mat one morning reads simply, "We were wrong. A friend." I pressed the paper to my chest until the ink warmed. Rachel bore a different kind of weather. She walked beside me on Sundays like a bright umbrella in an overcast street. She answered harsh whispers with a hand on my elbow and a clear young voice. "She keeps the books right," she'd tell someone who muttered. Sometimes she'd come home furious and then quieter, and I'd find her in the kitchen at midnight, tracing the grooves of the ledger pages with her finger as if reading the years back into order. There were also people who returned with eyes lowered, footsteps tentative, those who needed to correct their courage with the courage of apology. Others avoided me as if proximity might stain them. That particular brand of avoidance is crushing because it is polite and final at once. It's the neighbor who crosses the street, the friend who chooses the other checkout line. It communicates without saying, and it asks you to make sense of it yourself. Every avoidance felt like a small ritual of exclusion. I learned to recognize it in the tilt of a head, the quick closure of a door, the way a hand paused halfway back for a handshake and then retreated. The church that had been my daily geography became an archipelago, little islands of friendship, and I feeling out at sea. At night, I would sit with Walter's Bible, fingers tracing the dog-eared page he'd left me, and think of the faces I'd known since Raised Voices and First Sunday Clothes. I remember bringing casseroles to funeral homes, pressing tissues into small palms, filling hymnals with neat notations in pencil. The memory hurt because it was true. It hurt because what they had built with their mouths, they now dismantled with their silence. Isolation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene from one of those books with a single cinematic rejection. It was a slow folding of community, each paper turned a little colder than the last. It left me noticing things I hadn't before. The squeak where someone's shoe scraped the floor because they couldn't meet my gaze. The space where a chair had been moved away. The way a potluck table filled with covered dishes but simultaneously avoided the place I used to stand. I held onto the ledger and my faith both, not because either offered warmth, but because both told me to keep the facts and the prayers present. People might close doors, but the work of truth opens its own, small ones. One apology, one honest conversation, one neighbor bringing a pie without asking why. The town's silence pressed against me like a tide. I learned to stand like a rock. The water did not stop. It simply lapped and lapped, and I kept my hands folded, my pearls cool at my throat, and waited. The pastor's voice filled the breathe, I told myself. The organ hummed under the sermon, a soft drone that made the air vibrate. Every face in the room seemed to tilt toward the pulpit. Diane sat behind him like a portrait, the perfection of her posture and argument. Jason's jaw was set in that too-still way young men have when they decide to become instruments. People around me shifted. Shoes scuffed, a child's whisper, the flap of a program page. When he named betrayal, Judas in the same breath as shepherding, the word lodged in my chest. My throat tightened. I counted the breaths between his phrases, the only thing I could control. The folder at my side felt like a sleeping animal, its weight a tiny punishable thing. I did not move my hands. I held them as if keeping them folded could keep the world intact. Then Walter came down the aisle. His feet made the softest sound on the worn runner. Up close I could see the tremor in his hands. The light from the stained glass cut through his white hair like a thin crown. He stopped beside me and touched my shoulder the way someone steadies a lamp that might tip. His voice was almost nothing. "Eleanor," he said, "leave the sanctuary now." There are moments when action comes before explanation. The touch at my shoulder was cool and decisive. I opened my mouth to demand why, what, who, but the words wouldn't form. My legs moved. Old muscle memory carried me up as if the pew remembered how I had always stood. Heads turned. 100 small sounds leaned toward me like curiosity sharpening into a blade. The foyer air hit me. Lemon cleaner and coffee and the faint dust of winter coats. Rachel stood near the glass doors, eyes rimmed red. She took my hand and her fingers fit under my thumb like a promise. "They're saying things, Grandma," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but she was steady. The little cross on her wrist glinted when she tucked a curl behind her ear. The sanctuary behind us thrummed with the sermon. The organ held a long note, and for a second it felt like the building itself was taking a breath. Then something else happened, a sound that was not part of any hymn. At first it was a thin, high creak like a door not quite closed. Then a crack, sharp and impossible, split the air. Time folded. The organ note bent. People looked up. For a blink I imagined a branch falling outside. Then glass screamed. The chandelier over the center aisle let go. It came down with a force that turned the hymn into silence. Crystal struck wood with a sound like thunder breaking into glass. Light exploded into 100 shards that sprayed like a frozen fire. The spot where I had been sitting flashed, a memory of heat, and then it was filled with shattered light and jagged edges and the stunned hush of people frozen in the aftermath. Gasps rolled through the room. Chairs scraped. Someone cried out. Dust rose in a slow cloud and tasted of metal and old candle wax. The varnish had the new sharp scent of fresh breakage. I stood at the doorway, my palms slick, the pearls at my throat suddenly heavier than they'd ever been. I looked for Pastor Franklin. He stood as if glued to the floor, the practiced calm stripped away and something raw and exposed showing in his face. For a heartbeat his eyes found mine. Surprise, I thought, real surprise, then something like calculation vanished. I saw him as if for the first time. A man who could make sermons swell like sails but whose hands had touched ledgers no one was meant to see. Walter was at my side before I'd noticed moving. He was crying, not theatrical but the thin, honest kind that comes when a man realizes a wrong is more than rumor. His fingers were trembling against my arm. "I didn't know," he said, the sentence breaking like a fragile cup. "They told me you were the problem. They said you had to be out." Jason said. He couldn't finish. He kept rubbing his thumb against the Bible tucked under his arm, as if the leather might smooth everything away. Behind him a small brass crucifix slipped from the edge of the altar and hit the floor with a soft clink, rolling into the dust. A candle on the communion table guttered and died. The tiny flame absolved as if on its own. Those tiny betrayals of still life felt like punctuation marks, endings that arrived noiselessly after the crash. People were moving now, hands helping where they could. Someone handed out bottles of water. Another murmured for calm. I felt Rachel's grip tighten, and for a second the world narrowed to the two of us and the jagged light between us and the pew where I had been sitting. I had left without asking why. And in the space that opened behind me, something like truth fell into place, loud as glass and twice as cutting. I remember the day the truth came like rain after a long drought, slow at first, then in a steady, undeniable fall. It didn't arrive as a thunderclap or a miracle. It arrived because a string of small things, the things I'd noticed and worried over for weeks, finally made sense together. Numbers and nerves and a tired man's conscience all braided into an answer. After the chandelier, the church felt like a house with one window shattered. People moved differently. They blinked too much. They shuffled papers as if hoping a single sheet would explain everything and make the noise stop. I went home with my folder in my bag, the papers warm from my body, and a crowd of questions sitting on my shoulders. Rachel would not let it go. She haunted the church office like a hawk until someone let her in. She called me at odd hours with small, urgent facts. Jason's phone had been audible in a meeting. A marked-up spreadsheet had been seen on a printer. An email thread that didn't add up. She had that stubborn, slightly reckless thing young people have. She would not let the town's polite silence cover over the truth. Then Walter came to my door. He stood on the step with his coat collar up against a wind that wasn't there. In his hands he held a thin envelope in his old Bible, the one with the dog-eared page I'd learned to recognize. His hands trembled more than usual. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with a thing all night and lost. "I can't sleep," he said before I could ask. I kept seeing it. The place where the chandelier landed. I kept hearing them say. He stopped and folded his hands around the Bible until the knuckles showed white. "I don't want to be part of hiding it anymore." He wasn't a dramatic man. What he gave the investigators was small, ordinary, but it mattered. He told them about Jason bringing him into an office and sliding a folder across the table, about the phrases he'd heard. "Make it look like Eleanor, and handle it quietly." He showed them the maintenance request he'd been asked to sign, the one that named a contractor who wasn't even on our church's list. He led them to the safe where he'd found a stack of receipts that didn't match the ledgers. He wept when he spoke. He did not make himself a hero. He made himself honest. My folder did its part too. The pieces I'd been too frightened to lay out in public, the transfers with no memo, the duplicate line items, the truncated notes in the margin, were cold and clear under the FBI's lights. Digital forensics, Rachel whispered to me afterward, is like a patient surgeon. Files bear the marks of who touched them and when. The planted documents had fingerprints, not mine. Emails had headers that belonged to Jason's account. It was not a flashing billboard. It was an accumulation of small, testable facts. The arrests were surreal in their ordinariness. Men who'd baptized babies and led prayer meetings were let out in handcuffs. People who had sung beside them for decades sat in rows with their hands folded and watched the slow unwinding of a life they thought they knew. Some cried. Some kept their heads down. A handful, the ones who had whispered and turned away for convenience, walked by as if the world had simply rearranged itself and their conscience needn't follow. When they came for my statement, I sat at a long table in a room that smelled like coffee and stale air and tried to tell the truth as I had lived it, carefully without grandeur. I read numbers. I answered questions. I showed the copies I'd made, the annotated lines I'd circled in red. It felt strange to talk about betrayal in the language of bank codes and timestamps, but facts are a kind of liturgy too. They bear witness. What surprised me was how much I needed the release that followed. Not the arrests themselves, justice does not make the broken places whole, but the way truth made people honest with themselves. Mr. Carter came to my door and pressed his hands into mine like an offering. Diane came too twice, humbling herself in a way I had not expected. She spoke with a voice that had the clatter of someone dropping a tray. Apology tumbled out imperfectly but real. Forgiveness did not come like a curtain falling. Came in small difficult steps. I forgave Walter when I saw the way we put up a new chandelier, simple and unpretentious. We repainted the lobby. We hired a pastor who asked more questions than he gave answers. The center for which the fundraiser had been planned will be built, but this time with transparent accounting and outside oversight. The town notices the change because the facts that made the change were there for anyone willing to look. Sometimes I wake at night and the house is full of the soft breaths of sleep. I reach for the pearls at my throat as if to check that they are still there. They are. Walter's Bible sits on my shelf with a ribbon he left in the page. I open it sometimes and read the margin note in his spindled hand. Keep watch. Keep faithful. It is not a demand. It is a plea. What that whole terrible season taught me is this. People will fail you, sometimes spectacularly. But a small, steady pursuit of truth, a ledger kept, a granddaughter who won't let go, a deacon who could not live with his silence, can reroute the path of a life. The sanctuary still holds prayers. It holds humming lights and the smell of lemon polish and hymnals thumbed by dozens of hands. And I, for all my aches, am still here, bruised, yes, but honest, and strangely grateful that the light fell where it did and not where I had been sitting. The sanctuary is quieter now. Not the soft silence of prayer, but a new kind of hush that comes after a storm. Settled, a little brittle, like the thin crust of ice that forms on a puddle and trembles when you step near it. I sit sometimes in the third pew on the right, the wood warm from afternoon sun, my fingers tracing the familiar groove where my hand has rested for decades. The varnish still smells faintly of lemon and old hymnals. It is a smell that stitches me back to the life I thought I knew. The chandelier that hangs now is modest, no crystal firework, just a simple ring of lights that hums steadier than the last. It throws soft pools across the aisle and makes the dust motes look like slow, obedient stars. When the light catches the pearl at my throat, it blinks like a tiny bell. I feel its weight and remember Harold's laugh as if it were a small, private hymn. Sometimes I press my thumb to the little crescent where the pearls press into my skin and think about fragility. What breaks easily and what endures. People come and go. Some avoid my eyes still. That small, careful distance lingers like a scar. Others come close, the way neighbors come when a porch light is on and the night is too cold. Rachel squeezes my hand as we pass the foyer. She is no longer the frightened 24-year-old who whispered in the doorway. She carries herself like someone who has seen how truth can be stubborn and beautiful. She laughs more now. The sound loosens something in me that has been tight for months. Walter visits on Tuesdays. He brings a thermos of coffee and sits with his hands folded around the cup until the heat bleeds into his palms. He does not speak of the chandelier unless I touch the subject. Instead, he tells me about the roof, about Mrs. Carter's arthritis, about the odd place where a gutter rattles in the wind. He still rubs at the scar above his eyebrow when he's uncomfortable. He still avoids my gaze sometimes, then suddenly meets it and offers a small, honest apology. I thought I was helping, he'll say, as if that explains everything and nothing at once. I tell him that I know. I tell him that I forgive. My forgiveness is not a sweeping absolution. It is a folding down of paper, careful and deliberate, like pressing a letter back into an envelope. Diane came once with her hands folded and her perfume softer than it used to be. She stood on my porch like someone waiting for a verdict and asked, too quietly, if there was anything she could do to make things right. I listened to the plea in her voice and saw the rawness beneath the polish. There is a part of me that remembers the time she brought pies to bereavements, the steady way she'd organize meals. There is another part that knows complicity can mask itself in kindness. I told her the truth, that reconciliation is work, not a phrase, and she left with a small imperfect promise. The ledger is tucked in a drawer at home. I pull it out sometimes at night and run a finger along the neat lines, the numbers that do not blink. They do not heal things, but they insist on truth. They remind me that ordinary things, receipts, stamped envelopes, a screenshot, can be the bones of justice. Rachel laid out the digital reports on my kitchen table the week the indictments were announced. Her insistence pulled the town's curtain aside. I think of her when the pews creak underfoot. The sound is a steady, private music. We rebuilt some things and left others as they are. The center for which the fundraiser was raised is moving forward, with oversight and an accountant from the county who carries a clipboard and a quiet look. The new pastor listens more than he speaks, and that change alone has been like rain on parched soil. People who left have come back slowly. Forgiveness has been piecemeal. Some apologies are muffled, some are sung in full voice at potlucks. One Sunday Mr. Carter pressed a hand into mine and said, "We were wrong." His voice shook. It was enough. At night the church doors catch the wind differently. The hinge we had repaired still sighs a little, the way old houses remember footsteps. Sometimes I linger in the doorway after service, palm against the cool wood where Harold used to rest his hand. I listen for the echo of shoes on the floor, the soft rustle of programs, the tiny coughs and cough drops, the hum of conversation. When the last person leaves, there is a single sound I have come to love and dread, footsteps receding, one by one, until the building holds only its own breath. There is a bench outside the church now, painted the same gentle blue as the steeple trim. It sits beneath a maple whose leaves are paper-thin in autumn. I like to sit there sometimes and watch the light shift across the glass windows. The bench echoes the seat inside where I used to sit with Harold. It is both memorial and marker. An empty place shaped by a presence. Children kick a soccer ball nearby and laughter splashes across the parking lot like soap suds. Once, the wind picked up and shut the heavy doors of the sanctuary with a finality that felt like punctuation. I watched the small brass plate on the door catch the sun and then go dark. The sound was a soft, decisive click that made me think of an ending and a beginning folded into the same motion. I stood and watched until the last breath of movement left the building, and then I walked home. At my kitchen table I leave Walter's old Bible open to the page he dog-eared. His margin note, "Keep watch. Keep faithful." Is written in a shaky hand that has steadied with time. I touch the ribbon he tucked between the pages and feel the slight grease of his thumb. The words are not a command. They are a kind of plea that has settled into the rooms of my life. Sometimes I wake in the dark and imagine the crash of glass. The memory still stings, but it no longer defines the whole of me. The ledger and the light, the small kindnesses and the hard reckonings, have remade the edges. I have sat with sorrow and held it like a neighbor's child. Awkward, careful, present. When I leave the church these days I do so slowly. My shoes make a small measured sound on the steps. I turn and look back at the stained glass window that throws its steady colors across the pews. The third pew on the right is empty when I leave it. That emptiness is not a void but a hush, the quiet the world needs to decide what comes next. I walk down the path and the wind moves a plastic hymn card pinned to the bulletin board. It flutters like a bird and then settles. The door closes behind me with a small, ordinary thud. Footsteps fade down the sidewalk. The maple's leaves whisper. The bench holds its hollow shape as the sun slides lower. The church breathes out. And I keep walking. After the arrests and the paperwork and the quiet, slow unpeeling of truth, the church felt like a room that had been opened and aired. The dust from the chandelier sat in the corners for weeks, catching light like a memory you couldn't quite sweep away. People stayed away at first, then came back in small, deliberate drips. A woman with a casserole, a man who used to laugh too loud sitting quietly in the choir, a young mother bringing her toddler because she didn't want the child to grow up thinking suspicion was normal. I kept my ledger in a drawer at home. Sometimes at night I would pull it out and trace the pencil marks with a fingertip, not to find comfort but to remind myself that facts keep their shape even when people do not. Paper is stubborn that way. It refuses to make excuses. It takes the blunt weight of a number and holds it like an honest bone. Walter came on Tuesdays with a thermos of coffee, and a smile that had learned how to be small and steady. He did not offer grand atonements. He brought the things he could manage, a bag of groceries and offered to mow the yard. The dog-eared Bible he'd tucked the night. Rachel grew into a kind of courage that surprised even her. She would not let the town's polite hush become fact. She kept pressing for records. She learned the language of digital dates and timestamps, and when the forensics people came, she sat at the table and looked at them like a family member who'd been overlooked for too long. She got better at smiling again. Sometimes when we walked past the bulletin board with its notices, she would squeeze my hand and nod at the bench outside the church, and I could tell she meant everything that bench had become. A place to sit and watch the light change, to remember what had been and what might be. The new pastor spoke less than the old one. He listened more. He asked questions at council meetings that made old men grumble, and young women breathe easier. The fundraiser for the community center restarted with oversight and outside accountants. The contractor came recommended by people who did not belong to the church. It was painfully boring, the sort of slow bureaucratic thing that nonetheless built trust like a mason laying brick by careful brick. Watching that process, I learned that rebuilding is never flashy. It is small meetings, receipts, signatures, the kinds of things my hands have always known how to do. People apologized in fits and starts. Some came with eyes full of shame. Others left notes folded under my doormat. Diane came once, late in the evening, and stood on my porch in the kind of silence that asks to be filled. She smelled of a softer perfume that night, and when she spoke, her voice was smaller. "We were scared," she said simply. It was not a justification. It was the truth of her choices. I told her that forgiveness is a thing you practice and that it does not erase learning. She stayed long enough to hear that and left with a promise she would not be able to keep perfectly, but made it anyway. Not everyone found their way back. Some doors stayed closed. The town has a memory that is long and practical. Some people prefer the comfort of certainty to the messy business of admission. There were moments I felt the old ache of betrayal press against my ribs again. A face turned away. A table where my casserole no longer sat. Those small absences are a kind of weather, and I have learned to dress myself for it. I still sit sometimes in the third pew on the right. The varnish grooves are part of me now. The new chandelier is modest and light. It throws a different kind of shadow, one that's even and deliberate. Sun hits my pearls in the late afternoon and they blink like tiny reminders. The smell of lemon polish and old hymnals is still there. A scent that stitches the present to the past so I can find my footing. At home, Walter's Bible lives on my shelf with his thumbprint in the ribbon he left. On the dog-eared page he wrote, in that thin, hesitant script, "Keep watch. Keep faithful." It reads like a prayer and a caution both. I rub the spine sometimes when the house is too quiet, and I think of the way a small, honest action, a deacon telling the truth, a granddaughter refusing to be silent, can reroute what we think of as inevitable. I forgave in pieces. I forgave because holding hate takes more space than my body can afford. I forgave because forgiveness is a practical thing. It lets me leave the house each morning without dragging old weights. But forgiveness didn't erase what happened. I hold the ledger like a candle. I keep its flame tended, not to scorch myself, but to make sure the room stays lit. People will fail you. They will sometimes do it spectacularly, from the pulpit or the boardroom or from the soft corners where power hides. That knowledge has reshaped my prayers. I pray not for a world without betrayal. I have learned that is impossible, but for the courage to notice it, name it, and do the small, tedious work of making things right. When I walk past the bench outside the church in the late light, I press my fingers to the wood. The maple above it drops one dry leaf that twists and lands near my shoe. Rachel laughs and says something about the stubbornness of autumn. Walter is somewhere behind us, humming a hymn he doesn't remember the words to. The town hums in its ordinary ways. The ledger is quiet in its drawer. The pearls at my throat feel cool. I have kept secrets and I have told them. I have learned that some truths come like broken glass, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. But I have also learned that light, even fractured, finds a way. I kept the light. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.